Hello and welcome. Today I want to talk about books, specifically my 5 recommendations for beginner philosophy books. One of my siblings recently asked me to compile just a short list for them to kind of whet their palate, get them started in philosophy, something that was accessible but interesting. And so I came up with a fairly diverse, I think, list that other people wouldn't recommend. And so I decided to make a YouTube video and break my YouTube hiatus. So hopefully you find these useful and accessible and enjoy them. I want to start off with the Classics of Political and Moral Philosophy, compiled by Stephen M. Kahn, or Can. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but it's a cool, long, abridged collection of various works ranging from, I just opened it, to Immanuel Kant's Groundwork for the Metaphysics of Morals. It also has like Martin Luther King speeches, but also Martin Luther, Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract. Earlier I saw some St. Augustine, and so just a really cool historically or chronologically oriented collection that really helps you pull from a lot of different ideas and authors in a way that's accessible and like you don't have to read straight through it. You can kind of pick and choose, and it's a good reference source. And so I think it's a super useful pickup and one that I'm glad I found used. My next recommendation, my second recommendation, is Being in Nothingness by Jean-Paul Sartre, or Sartre as the French would say, but much more French. This is another long one, and it is something you'd probably read altogether. But I think that especially now, there are a lot of people, there's a certain vein of people who get interested in philosophy because of the existentialist framework and existentialist concerns. And so Sartre is maybe the most prominent and prolific, at least, writer within the existentialist framework, whether it be this magnum opus of his right here, or his plays, or his books like Nausea. I haven't read Nausea yet, but I've read No Exit and some of his other plays that are awesome. They got me into drama, he and Camus. And so I think he's a super accessible writer, really great voice because of his fiction writing that makes this one of the, even though it's long and seems intimidating, it's actually pretty accessible. Next is Being in Time by Martin Heidegger. This is a shorter one compared to the last two suggestions, and I think it's one of those, especially in psychology, that you're going to be familiar with, even if you don't know much about Heidegger. And I think, if I'm picking up on things correctly, that Sartre reworked Being in Time essentially in his writing of Being in Nothingness. That is almost a reworking of Heidegger, and so I thought that was super interesting. And I think that understanding the Dasein and just as ontological thinking is super useful, and I think also one of those that is something relevant to the existentialist framework and concerns. And I think if you have to deal with modern philosophy, you have to deal with Heidegger at some point, and so Being in Time is his magnum opus. And apparently I am thinking a lot of magnum opuses today, because my next recommendation is Immanuel Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which is epistemological, so having to do with truth and knowledge. But I mean, talk about a classic work that's fundamental to modern philosophy. There's a reason that people are calling Kant, or did call Kant, and still do call Kant, the Copernican revolution of philosophy. And really, Western philosophy really kind of stems from Kant, as it stands today. And so, I think even Kant would acknowledge that he's not the greatest writer, but I think there's so much out there in like in terms of scholarship on Kant, and even this introduction to this Penguin Classic copy gives a really good overview of what the ideas are, kind of working step by step in accessible language that Kant should be fairly accessible to anyone who's interested in epistemology. And if you're interested in epistemology and truth and knowing, you have to read Kant. You have to deal with Kant. So that is a classic. And last is Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit. This one, I think, gets a bad rap from some people. But again, there's so much, and I think that it's so interesting and kind of varied in the way Hegel talks or writes in terms of going from epistemology to culture to ethics, that it never gets boring, and so it's kind of easy to just read through. And similar to Kant, this is a reaction to Kant as I understand it, and so there's also a lot of scholarship on Hegel that maybe isn't so popular today, but is seeing some rejuvenation. And so Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit is his magnum opus, and definitely something to contend with. And so that wraps it up for those 5 recommendations. But if you know anything about philosophy going into this, or the difficulty of books, I think hopefully you'll recognize that those weren't serious recommendations, because those are all, especially the last 4, basically impenetrable. Those are some of the hardest works in my collection, in my library, that I could find. And so I thought I'd make a little satirical video, but you won't leave here without actual recommendations, because I do have a real 5 collection. And the first is Plato's Dialogues, which is what everyone starts with. Every recommendation video I've ever seen talks about Plato. Every online article suggests Plato because he's accessible and hugely important to Western philosophy. This specific copy is one of my favorites in my library, one of my favorite hardcovers. It sits right by my bed, kind of like the Bible. And so it contains the Apology, his Credo, Phaedo, Symposium, and all of the Republic, actually, in all of this little copy. Look at this red top, too. That's so cool. And so, beautiful copy, and varied studies from Plato. The dialogues are accessible because they're written as speech, almost like a play. And so, super, I mean, in terms of accessibility and importance, it's hard to get better than Plato, but I'll try with the next 4 works, because my second real suggestion is The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. I am a big Camus fan, as a lot of people are today, because he is hot and a beautiful, beautiful man. And so everyone loves him for that, but also because the absurd is super interesting and a really cool take on the, I don't want to say existentialist framework, because I think he would reject that title, but a kind of branching off from existentialism as his own answer. And I think that The Myth of Sisyphus isn't taken as seriously as maybe it should. I am currently writing a study on The Myth of Sisyphus and Camus' The Rebel, which is his other big philosophical essay. And really, even years ago, before I read any Camus, just hearing about him, I figured he would be something or someone I would resonate with, and that has turned out to be really true. And so I think it's super accessible. His style is beautiful because he writes great fiction. He's a big fan of Dostoevsky and Kafka, and you can kind of see that influence in him, maybe particularly Kafka and Hemingway in his writing, in works like The Stranger. But with The Myth of Sisyphus, it's accessible, it is full of really interesting ideas, and kind of philosophically heavy for him. And so I think it's definitely something that is an easier read to start off with that will address a lot of the concerns I think people come in with philosophy. Like I was mentioning with existentialism earlier, like why am I here, the purpose, meaning of life, ethics. So really good one. My third is Soren Kierkegaard's Fear and Trembling from everyone's favorite theologian. This one is also shorter. His style is gorgeous. He's a gorgeous writer. And this holds some really cool ideas, including like his leap of faith argument, which is, as far as I know, what is the most famous idea of his. And so super interesting and accessible read. My fourth copy is Alistair MacIntyre's A Short History of Ethics. And he is one who I don't hear about as much. You kind of a secondary level in terms of popularity and fame within philosophical circles, so you probably wouldn't hear much about him unless you've been kind of consuming philosophical content online or whatever for a little bit. But I picked this up used just on a whim, and then as I started reading it, started looking into MacIntyre, and he's kind of a leading figure, or was a leading figure in the rejuvenation of Aristotelian ethics and virtue ethics. And so super fascinating. He goes through all kinds of writers briefly, like almost like writing essays for different writers in their ethics, from Plato to Aristotle to Martin Luther to Machiavelli to Nietzsche and Kierkegaard into the 60s, kind of explaining what was wrong with their ideas, and how it kind of shaped the next kind of branch of ethical thinking. And so super useful, super interesting, and kind of also a good place to start maybe before reading his After Virtue, which is his real classic book on virtue ethics. And so my final copy, I'm about to sneeze, never mind, is John Stuart Mill's On Liberty and Utilitarianism. On Liberty is a political work, and utilitarianism obviously is the explanation and description of his ethical framework. He and Jeremy Bentham's ethical framework. Both are super accessible. I think utilitarianism in this copy is 70-something pages, so short. He begins with describing what utilitarianism is, and then kind of handily deals with some of the critiques of the framework. This specific copy also includes the subjection of women, the contest in America, and his inaugural address delivered to the University of St. Andrews. And so in terms of like clear writing, I don't know if I've ever read a prominent philosopher as clear as Mill. And I read him after reading a lot from Joshua Green, and his moral psychological research that addresses and supports utilitarianism. And so just to kind of clarify Green's position, and I found this super accessible and interesting, and what an amazing example of a philosopher who can think clearly and argue clearly. So those are my real 5 recommendations. I think some of them are ones that you wouldn't hear often from people making suggestions about philosophy books, beginner philosophy books, and some are very prominent in those kinds of lists. But I hope you find use for them, and I hope you find them interesting, and I hope they are actually accessible. So thank you, and enjoy your reading.